Let me say two preliminary remarks about my paper. First, two ways it sort of is not what was advertised. I really will not say much about the concept of visible unity today. I'll talk mostly about reconciled diversity. For an analysis of the concept of visible unity, I recommend looking at the text from the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany from 2017, Visible Unity of the Church from a Lutheran Perspective. Whatever you think about its particular Lutheran theological outlook, it is a very good analysis of the sort of logic of the concept of visible unity. Second, I won't really be doing what Peter DeMay said earlier I would be doing, that is outlining a general Catholic approach to models of unity. I understood from my emails with the leadership that I'd be doing something different, discussing the concept of reconciled diversity as it developed in the ecumenical movement. I will try and add some things. I've tried to do a little work during what was for me the breakfast break to fill in a bit what Peter DeMay said I would be doing. But actually, for reasons I'll mention, there isn't really much of a development of Catholic models of unity in the same way that there has been in the larger ecumenical movement or in the Protestant world. Also, I should note that the critical arguments, and I am going to make a critical argument, is not particularly distinctively Catholic, although it's the sort of things Catholics have said. What I say is less shaped by my thinking about Catholic ecclesiology than by my work on trying to write a comprehensive history of American ecumenical dialogues and agreements. The criticisms I'll make, as I'll note, have also been made by Protestants, and there are also criticisms I made in print when I was a Lutheran. I was received in the Catholic Church in 2010. So my presentation. The Lambeth Appeal to All Christian People and the Ecumenical Patriarch's letter unto the churches of Christ everywhere were decisive moments that set the modern ecumenical movement on its path. That movement underwent changes as it encountered obstacles and opportunities. In this presentation, I will briefly examine the way one change, a shift in how the unity we seek is conceived, presents a particular present challenge. The present moment is, I believe, an ecumenically precarious one. The last decades of the 20th century saw important ecumenical developments. A wave of full communion agreements among Protestant and Anglican churches in Europe and North America altered the ecumenical context. Bilateral dialogues achieved perhaps their greatest achievement in the adoption of the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification by the churches of the Lutheran World Federation and the Catholic Church. The first 20 years of this century, however, have proven far less fruitful. The full communion agreements among the traditional Protestant and Anglican churches have not proved a model for relations with Catholics, Orthodox, or for relations with evangelical and Pentecostal churches. As I will argue below, these agreements have turned out to be less than they seemed. Bilateral dialogues have made little progress on outstanding issues. Now, drawing on studies of patterns of punctuated change in the history of science and in evolutionary biology, I have argued elsewhere that we have perhaps come to the end of a period of revolutionary ecumenism, in which foundational assumptions were called into question and the sphere of the realistically possible seemed to widen. And I think we are now entering a time of what one can call normal ecumenism, in which concepts and practices and realities again fall into stable patterns resistant to change. We are, I believe, at the end of the age of breakthroughs. The decisive question is what form the new normal will take. My fear is that ecumenism will come to be seen as a 20th century phenomenon that made its contribution and altered the ecclesial landscape in real but limited ways, but lives on only in stock rhetorical phrases trotted out for ceremonial occasions. We need to ask, if ecumenical activity is not oriented to breakthrough, what then is its focus? In this presentation, as the only North American presenter, and the only presenter not resident in Europe, I will pay particular attention to recent American ecumenical experience. The problem I will address, though, is a general one. But the explosion of full communion agreements in the United States over the last 25 years makes the U.S. something of a test case for recent models of church unity. I would add, my years at the Strasbourg Ecumenical Institute and my engagement in U.S. ecumenism have taught me that ecumenical discussions are often geographically provincial in their horizon, limited our understanding in unhelpful ways. Now, the story of the development of different models of church unity can only be quickly noted here. Harding Meyer's book, That All May Be One, in the original German Ökumenische Zielvorstellung, remains a useful description of that history of the discussion of models of unity. Unity in the early ecumenical movement tended to be understood in the form of an integrated church structure. The ecumenical goal would be a single church, single in the sense that a Protestant denomination or the Russian Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church is a single church. Unity would mean that the uniting churches would disappear into a united church. The Church of South India embodied that approach, and that approach is in the background of the 1961 New Delhi Statement on the Unity We Seek. During the third quarter of the 20th century, however, this model proved difficult to realize. Major efforts to achieve organic unity among Anglican and Protestant churches, for example, the East Africa discussions in the 1950s and 60s, or in the United States, the consultation on church union, failed after years of discussion. In addition, theological criticism began to be raised about models of church unity that required the uniting churches to disappear into a united church. The ecumenical engagement of the Catholic Church following the Second Vatican Council also made organic unity as structural integration less attractive to many Protestant ecumenists. The adoption of the Lauenburg Agreement among Lutheran, Reformed, and United churches in Central Europe in 1973 offered a concrete example of a different ecumenical approach. During the 1970s and 1980s, there thus appeared models of unity and reconciled diversity, in which churches would come into true unity without losing their identity as distinct churches with distinct theological, liturgical, and canonical traditions. Unity but not uniformity became the watchword. The goal of a single integrated church was replaced by unity as a communion of churches, distinct yet one, and thus unity as full communion came to be a common term for such models. This development was part of a widespread shift in ecclesiology toward communion as the leading principle in Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant understandings of the church. In such a context, Joseph Ratzinger could call for an understanding of church unity in which the churches would, quote, remain churches, yet become one church. Reconciled diversity thus became a term almost universally accepted, but with so general a meaning that it was open to specification in many ways. Various church bodies worked out their own variation on this theme. For example, the World Council of Churches, in the 1991 statement of the Canberra Assembly, The Unity of the Church, Gift and Calling, or the statement of the Lutheran World Federation's 1984 Budapest Assembly on the Unity We Seek. Individual bilateral dialogues also developed their own sketches of such unity. For example, texts from the International Catholic Lutheran Dialogue in its proposal of Facing Unity, and the International Anglican Lutheran Working Group in its description of full communion in the Koldash report. Let me at this point note the role of the Catholic Church, and this is sort of an aside. I wanted to follow up a bit on what I did not include in the original text, but which Peter DeMay said I'd be doing, so I think I need to do it a bit. This discussion of models of unity was mostly an intra-Protestant discussion within ecumenical contexts, with input from Orthodox ecclesiology, especially the concept of communion, and to a lesser degree from Catholic theology. And so you don't really have the development of concrete models of unity in the Catholic theological world as you have had in the ecumenical movement as a whole, or in the Protestant world. I think there's a reason for that, that usually you'll develop more concrete models of unity as you get actually closer to the actual possibility of achieving full communion or whatever you're going to call it. When the Catholic Church, for example, I'm going to note in a second, when the Lutheran Church thought they were getting close to that, they developed a model. But for the most part, there hasn't been the pressure to develop concrete models. I think the most recent, after Vatican II, and authoritative at the universal level statement on what unity might look like to the Catholic Church is in Ut Unum Sint, John Paul II's encyclical from the 1990s, particularly paragraphs 88 through 99 on the role of the papacy. I think it's clear in Ut Unum Sint that the Catholic Church envisages unity as a communion of local or particular churches headed by someone called bishop, and all these local churches and their bishops are in communion with the Bishop of Rome. But Ut Unum Sint called for a dialogue, a fraternal dialogue, on what shape that leadership of the Bishop of Rome would take. Now, and John Paul was open. The Pope had certain tasks, perhaps, he needs to carry out, but one needed to be open-minded on exactly what the role of the Catholic Church of the Pope might be. Now, unfortunately, that call did not lead to much discussion. Again, as Professor Pierce noted, the problem of reception. Few churches responded to that call, and it was not taken up as a thematic focus in the dialogues for the most part. An exception might be the Catholic Orthodox Ravenna statement, but even that did not get very specific, although I'll bow to others who may know that text better than I do. And I would note there's also the problem on the Orthodox side of the non-involvement at a crucial stage of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, at the local level, it'd be very useful for people to take another look at the statement from the early 1980s of the International Lutheran Catholic Dialogue in Facing Unity. It had a very precise plan, model of unity of growing toward interlocking episcopates with mutual consecration of bishops, growing into a kind of joint episcopate while the churches remain distinct. This model in Facing Unity was, however, mostly ignored, and when it wasn't ignored, at least in the Protestant world, was severely criticized. And I think also the possibility of this kind of integration of episcopal ministries seemed less possible with the growth of differences on women's ordination and lately on questions of sexuality. I would note that for the Catholic Church, there are more possibilities for local diversity than people may realize. For example, orders, that is, different Catholic orders. I attend a parish staffed by members of the Oratorian community, the same community of John Henry Newman. When I don't go there, I go to the Dominican house, where the Dominicans run their own world to a certain degree. I mean, I regularly try and irritate them by saying good words about Duns Scotus and reminding him that he's a blessed of the Catholic Church. Anna Marie Meyer, professor at Leuven University there, has an interesting article exploring Anglican ordinariates as an ecumenical model of diversity at the local level. She finds it to be a real but limited usefulness, but still there are possibilities. But because I think actual lived unity is not seen as an immediate possibility, models have not been elaborated. One might say that's a good thing. It does leave things rather vague, but perhaps as one gets closer to unity, if and when that happens, that would be a better time to work out concrete models. And I can say from my own ecumenical experience, I was the observer for the World Council of Churches in Arctic in the 1990s. There was certainly no consensus between Catholics and Anglicans, among the Anglicans or among the Catholics, on what the precise goal was. I remember a vigorous discussion, Mark Santer, the Anglican Bishop of Birmingham, who wanted to vigorously reject the notion of a sort of Eastern Catholic model for Anglicanism. So there is diversity there. So you've got a rather mixed Catholic picture. Let me return to my paper. The transition that took place from organic unity to reconciled diversity or full communion was not without its critics, arguing sometimes from opposite perspectives. On the one hand, such prominent ecumenical figures as Lucas Fisher from a Reformed perspective and Mary Tanner from an Anglican perspective asked whether unity and reconciled diversity was unity in a meaningful sense, or simply a sort of altar and pulpit fellowship. Those who elaborated such models sought to answer such criticisms by including in such models requirements of common life. For example, the Lutheran World Federation statement spoke of, quote, unity in a committed fellowship, able to make common decisions and to act in common. On the other hand, you had criticisms from a different angle from two Protestant church bodies, which formulated statements in the early 20th century on the ecumenical goal. Church communion according to an evangelical understanding from the Evangelical Church in Germany, the EKD, in 2001, and ecumenism according to an evangelical Lutheran understanding from the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Germany in 2004. Both built on an understanding of church unity truly realized in the event of faith in the gospel, a unity which is expressed but not realized in particular declarations and structures of fellowship. Within church fellowship, structures of common decision-making can be no more than optional. Now, these German statements were themselves harshly criticized, not only by Catholics, but by fellow Protestants in the ecumenical world. For example, a particularly vigorous critique from Risto Saarinen of Finland in an article entitled Neither Visible Unity Nor Common Understanding. Now, as it has turned out, the actual elaboration of agreements along the lines of unity and reconciled diversity over the last 30 years have, I believe, rather fully justified the criticisms of Fisher and Tanner, since they have mostly fallen in line with the ecumenical conclusions, though not the theological underpinnings, of the German Protestant statements of 2001 and 2004. Over the last 30 years, the closer concrete descriptions of full community or reconciled diversity came to actual practice, the weaker became the requirements of common life, action, and decision. The description of full communion, offered by the International Anglican Lutheran Working Group in 1983, the Koldash Report, did not speak at all of common decision-making, but only of, quote, recognized organs of regular consultation and communication. Now, while that description is perhaps understandable in the situation of churches in different countries, the thinness of the consultation envisaged becomes more striking in the case of churches inhabiting the same territory. As noted, the United States saw the passage of a wide range of full communion agreements in the 1990s and 2000s. Anglican Lutheran, Anglican Moravian, Disciples United Church of Christ, Lutheran Reformed, Lutheran Methodist, Lutheran Moravian, Methodist Moravian, and Moravian Reformed. These agreements all involve mutual recognition of ministries, membership, and sacraments. All involve some provision for the mutual availability of clergy. All lacked, however, not only any provision for common decision-making, but also structures for mutual consultation by decision-making bodies. Consultation committees have often been created, but these usually do not include representatives from actual decision-making bodies. On the whole, common life in Christ is simply absent at all levels. As Joseph Small, former director of the Office for Theology and Worship of the Presbyterian Church USA, has described the situation, quote, churches in full communion continue to frame theological statements, take moral positions, order ministries, and amend polities without consultation, let alone the concurrence of sister churches. Dependable data is difficult to find for the effect of full communion agreements on the local churches. However, as far as I can see, the same description applies. Despite what its advocates, including myself, argued at the time, newer models of full communion turned out to be little different than altar and pulpit fellowship. The agreements do mean that movement, both temporary and permanent, among American Protestant churches has become much more free for both laity and clergy. The lowering of barriers reflects a general decline of interdenominational tension. But the churches remain no less divided in their daily life. The situation remains one of what I have called friendly division with porous borders. As Reinhard Hutter has noted, reconciled diversity has turned out in practice to be reconciled indifference. Now, to some degree, this outcome has been shaped by the particular realities of American church life, the extreme splintering of denominations, an anti-intellectual tradition that denigrates formal doctrine, a tendency to instrumentalize religion. but it also illustrates the drift of recent ecumenical agreements toward minimal understandings of the requirements of church unity. Particularly troublesome, I think, is the question whether such pictures of unity represent, without any intention on their author's part, an accommodation to the culture of consumer capitalism. Lutheran, Anglican, Methodist, even Catholic and Orthodox become differentiated consumer choices in the religious marketplace, much like Coca-Cola and Pepsi. The market does not require unity, but only orderly rules of friendly competition and a tolerance for individual preference. Unity is even to be avoided, so that market forces can be allowed to fulfill or perhaps elicit the full range of, quote, religious needs. Thus, the move from organic unity to reconciled diversity presents an ambiguous picture. As a move beyond simple models of corporate merger or an ecumenism of return, it has been an important and essential step forward, both in general ecclesiology and in concrete ecumenical discussions. No more than organic unity, however, does reconciled diversity present us with an actual model of unity, but rather with a framework within which models of unity of very different and perhaps incompatible sorts can be worked out. Discussions over the past half-century have shown that the traditional ecclesiological differences that had previously blocked our agreement on the nature of the church's unity simply show up in new forms in diverse models of reconciled diversity. Now, where does this history leave us today? Let me end quickly with three very brief comments. First, we obviously need to discuss the ecclesiological issues embedded in conflicting pictures of reconciled diversity, and in particular, the forms of common decision-making and common life that unity in Christ calls for. That these efforts have defied resolution for so long should lead us to ask fundamental questions and seek clarity. What reasons, both pragmatic and theological, account for the recalcitrant character of these differences? Whether the by now traditional forms of dialogue, with its goal of a common statement that maximizes agreement, is best suited to that discussion needs to be considered. More open-ended dialogue, with a greater focus on the issues and their logic than on the formation of a common statement, might prove more helpful. And I fully endorse Professor Pierce's comment on the usefulness of the meeting of actual bishops. We need to get over the academic delusion that professors actually count for very much. Second, we need to consider the practical significance of the asymmetry between different understandings of unity. Reconciled diversity admits of different degrees and forms. One church might understand a particular form of communion as only an interim step to genuine unity, while another church views that form of communion as the achievement of the ecumenical goal. Should such churches adopt a proposal that is understood in different ways by the two sides? The question strikes me as important and complex, involving both theological and prudential judgments. It is made more complex by the recognition of cultural pressures towards seeing minimal forms of reconciled diversity as all that is truly called for. Third and last, if I am correct, and we are entering a new normal in which ecumenical breakthroughs are not to be expected, then the particular challenge of the immediate future is to avoid the twin temptations of, on the one hand, settling down in the wilderness and ignoring the lamentable reality of division, and on the other, forcing the ecumenical issue by advocating inadequate forms of unity that sacrifice ecclesiological conviction without bringing true unity. My worry is that uncritical rhetoric of reconciled diversity oddly succumbs to both possibilities at once. We are tempted to settle in the wilderness and call it the promised land. What is needed for the immediate future is not some models of the final ecumenical goal, but models for living partial unity in a way that is faithful both to our common faith and to our conflicting convictions about essential aspects of that faith. Thank you.